It all started on a bright Saturday morning, the kind where the sun spilled across the sidewalks and neighbors were already out mowing lawns or sipping coffee on their porches. The community was calm, predictable. Almost too perfect exactly, the kind of place you'd expect from a neighborhood governed by a strict homeowners association. The lawns looked like green carpets. The fences were painted white, and the mailboxes stood evenly like soldiers in a row. From the outside, this neighborhood seemed flawless. But behind the manicured hedges and carefully enforced rules, something darker had been brewing. The HOA president, a woman named Marjorie, ruled over the neighborhood like a queen with an iron fist. She was known for her clipboard, her oversized sunglasses, and her uncanny ability to spot even the tiniest deviation from the HOA handbook. To most, she was a nuisance. To some, she was a tyrant. And to me, she was about to become my biggest problem. The letter arrived without warning. A plain white envelope slipped into my mailbox, stamped with the HOA seal. At first glance, it looked like one of the usual notices or reminders about trash bins or landscaping rules. But when I tore it open and read the words, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just a warning. It was a fine. A $500 fine. The reason, according to the letter, I had violated HOA policy by leaving unauthorized items in plain sight. The alleged items: a garden hose coiled by the side of my house and a ladder leaning against the garage. It sounded ridiculous. A hose and a ladder? These weren't permanent fixtures. They weren't unsightly. And they certainly weren't the kind of offenses worth $5,000. But the fine was written in bold ink, and at the bottom of the page was Marjorie's signature. To her, this was official business. To me, it was a slap in the face. The more I thought about it, the more suspicious it seemed. I'd lived in the neighborhood long enough to know the rules, and while the HOA was strict, fines of that size weren't common for something so trivial. Neighbors had received warnings before: $25 fees for untrimmed hedges, $50 for leaving trash bins out overnight, but $500. That was unheard of. It felt like a shakedown, and something in my gut told me that this wasn't just about a hose and a ladder. Something was off. As the weekend passed, I noticed Marjorie patrolling the neighborhood more than usual. She walked slowly down the sidewalks, jotting notes onto her clipboard, pausing to snap pictures of houses with her phone. It was almost theatrical, like she wanted everyone to see her in action, to know she was watching. Her power wasn't in the rules themselves, it was in the fear she created. And now, I was her target. I considered paying the fine just to make it go away, but every time I held the notice in my hands, my anger grew. Why should I hand over $500 for something so ridiculous? And more importantly, where was that money even going? The letter didn't explain what the fine would fund. There was no mention of improvements, no breakdown of HOA expenses, just a demand for payment, with the threat of additional penalties if I failed to comply. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I began with the HOA handbook, flipping through pages of rules that covered everything from paint colors to mailbox designs. Nowhere did it say anything about hoses or ladders being a violation worthy of a fine. In fact, the handbook stated that minor items left temporarily outside were permissible as long as they weren't hazardous or obstructing public areas. My so-called violation didn't fit the criteria at all. This wasn't just unfair, it was fraudulent. Still, one detail gnawed at me. The signature. Marjorie had signed it personally, not as part of a board decision. That was unusual. HOA fines typically went through a process, reviewed by the board, with documented evidence and minutes from meetings. Yet here was a fine issued directly, with no mention of board approval. It looked less like an official ruling and more like Marjorie's personal scheme. The more I pieced it together, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern. And if Marjorie had targeted me, how many others had fallen into her trap before? How many neighbors had quietly paid their fines, too scared to fight back. The possibility made my skin crawl. Maybe this wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood at all. Maybe this was about Marjorie lining her own pockets. As Sunday evening faded into night, I tucked the letter into a folder and sat back, staring out the window at the quiet street. Porch lights flickered on, sprinklers hissed, and Marjorie's house loomed across the cold dark, except for the faint glow of a lamp in the front room. Somewhere inside, she was probably congratulating herself, confident that I'd fold like so many others. But she was wrong. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And by the time it was over, Marjorie wouldn't just lose her power, she'd lose everything. The letter might have been signed by Marjorie, but I knew the real story wouldn't be written in ink. It would be buried in paper trails, financial records, and the whispers of neighbors who had quietly paid their dues, never daring to question where their money truly went. If I wanted to understand why I was fined $500 for something as absurd as a garden hose, I needed to start with the HOA itself. The HOA wasn't just a group of volunteers. It was an organization with real authority, one that controlled everything from landscaping standards to the yearly budget. And, like most organizations, it collected money. Every household in the neighborhood paid monthly dues, small enough to seem manageable, but significant when multiplied across dozens of homes. That money was supposed to fund community upkeep or paving sidewalks, repairing fences, maintaining the pool. But lately, I had noticed something strange. The sidewalks weren't being repaired. The fences leaned a little more each year. And the pool? It had been closed for maintenance for almost 6 months, with no sign of progress. Yet the HOA continued to collect the same dues, along with fines that seemed to pop up more frequently than ever. Where was the money going? I started with my own records. Old notices, receipts, and newsletters sat tucked away in drawers and folders, forgotten until now. As I sifted through the papers, a pattern began to emerge. Over the past year, the HOA had issued more fines than in the 3 years prior, combined. They weren't always large $50 here. $75 there, but they were consistent. And curiously, nearly all of them bore Marjorie's signature. It was unusual for a president to handle fines directly, yet she seemed to insert herself into every case. My suspicion grew. I needed more evidence. The next morning, I walked the neighborhood with a casual eye, pretending to admire the freshly trimmed lawns while quietly scanning for clues. A few doors down, I spotted Mr. Alvarez, an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. His yard was immaculate, yet I remembered seeing him at the mailbox a few weeks earlier, grumbling as he opened a notice. When I later asked how things were going, he'd muttered something about the HOA bleeding him dry. Another neighbor! The Harris family had mentioned cutting back on community events because they'd been fined twice in 1 month. For what? They didn't say. The more I thought about it, the more faces came to mind, each one carrying that same quiet frustration. People weren't just annoyed by the HOA, they were scared of it. And Marjorie thrived on that fear. By midday, I returned home with a notebook full of observations and a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just me. This was bigger, much bigger. But suspicions alone wouldn't be enough. I needed proof. That's when I turned my attention to the HOA's financial statements. By law, the association was required to keep records accessible to homeowners. Most people never bothered to request them, assuming the money was being managed responsibly. But I wasn't most people anymore. I emailed the treasurer, a quiet man named Douglas, who rarely spoke at meetings, and requested the latest reports. His response came faster than I expected within the hour. A PDF landed in my inbox. The numbers told a story, but not the one I expected. The budget listed community maintenance, landscaping, administrative costs, and a mysterious line item labeled miscellaneous operations. It was this category that immediately stood out. Over the past 12 months, more than $15,000 had been funneled into it, almost a quarter of the HOA's entire budget. There were no details, no explanations, just vague notations that didn't add up. I cross-referenced the fines I had collected from old notices. Each one matched a spike in the miscellaneous category. When fines went up, so did the numbers. It was as if every dollar collected disappeared into that black hole. And who had the authority to approve it? The president! Marjorie. The picture was becoming clearer. She wasn't just inventing fines for control. She was inventing them for profit. As I sat back in my chair, the reality of the situation sank in. Marjorie had turned the HOA into a personal cash machine, bleeding her neighbors with bogus violations and pocketing the results. It was bold. It was reckless. And it was hidden in plain sight. But if I could see it, others could too. The question now was, who would listen? I decided to start small. At the next HOA board meeting, I would attend with my notes, my records, and the financial report highlighted in glaring yellow. I wouldn't accuse her outright, not yet, but I would ask questions, the kind that couldn't easily be brushed aside. If Marjorie thought she could intimidate me into silence, she was about to learn that not everyone in this neighborhood played by her rules. As the day of the meeting approached, I felt the tension building. Each time I saw Marjorie striding down the street with her clipboard, I couldn't help but wonder if she knew what I was planning. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but I could feel them on me, sharp and suspicious. The night of the meeting, the community center buzzed with quiet chatter. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, clutching papers and whispering complaints. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, her clipboard resting like a weapon beside her. The other board members looked weary, avoiding her gaze, as if they'd long since given up challenging her. When my turn came to speak, I rose slowly, my folder clutched in one hand. All eyes turned toward me. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. And in that moment, as I prepared to expose the cracks in Marjorie's perfect facade, I realized the real battle was only just beginning. The community center smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the kind of scent that clung to spaces where too many meetings had been held and too few problems had ever been solved. Folding chairs squeaked against the floor as neighbors shuffled into their seats. The atmosphere felt different tonight. It wasn't tea, the usual casual gathering, where people half listened to updates about landscaping contracts or holiday decorations. No, tonight, there was a buzz, a crackle of unease. People were restless, tired, and maybe, just maybe, ready to listen. At the head of the table sat Marjorie, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Her presence dominated the room before she even spoke. The clipboard rested at her side, the same one she used to issue fines like weapons, and her oversized sunglasses perched firmly on her nose despite the fact that it was nearly 8 in the evening. She wore them like armor, a barrier between herself and the people she ruled over. The meeting began in its usual dry, methodical way. Updates on landscaping, a brief mention of security patrols. Discussion about repainting the playground fence that somehow never seemed to get done. Marjorie's voice cut through every item with the same tone, firm, controlling, dismissive of any questions that might slow her down. But I wasn't here to listen. I was here to expose. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, I stood. My folder felt heavy in my hand, filled with weeks of research, notes, and highlighted reports. The room went still. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Curious, cautious, waiting. I spoke slowly, carefully, framing my words not as accusations, but as questions. Why had fines increased so dramatically in the past year? Why were so many of them signed off directly by the president rather than processed through the board? Why was nearly a quarter of the HOA's budget funneled into a category labeled only as miscellaneous operations? Each question hung in the air like a spark waiting for fuel. Neighbors shifted in their seats, heads turned toward Marjorie. Even the board members, who usually avoided confrontation, glanced up from their papers with unease. Marjorie's reaction was immediate and sharp. Her lips tightened, her jaw clenched, and she leaned forward as if preparing for battle. She dismissed my questions as misunderstandings, brushed them aside with a wave of her hand. But the way she avoided eye contact told another story. I pressed further. I pointed out the timing of the fines, how they lined up perfectly with unexplained withdrawals in the budget. I mentioned the $500 notice I had received for something as trivial as a garden hose and ladder violations, not even listed in the handbook. My words were calm, steady, but underneath them was a fire that couldn't be ignored. The room stirred. Whispers spread like ripples on water. People exchanged looks, their suspicion feeding on itself. For the first time, Marjorie wasn't the only one controlling the room. Her voice grew louder, sharper, as she insisted everything was within policy. But the more she defended, the weaker she sounded. Her explanations were vague, contradictory, designed to confuse rather than clarify, and the neighbors' people who had once stayed silent were beginning to notice. Mr. Alvarez, the elderly man with the immaculate yard, raised his hand. His voice trembled but carried weight as he admitted he had paid 3 fines in the past 6 months, all signed by Marjorie, for violations that seemed trivial at best. Another neighbor followed, then another. Stories spilled out, each one echoing the same theme: ridiculous fines, signed personally, unexplained charges. The meeting had shifted. It was no longer me against Marjorie. It was the neighborhood against her. I watched her carefully. For the first time, cracks appeared in her facade. The confidence in her posture slipped. She gripped her clipboard tighter, her knuckles pale. The sunglasses stayed on, but her body language betrayed her. She was cornered, and she knew it. But Marjorie wasn't the type to back down quietly. She lashed out, accusing me of stirring trouble, of undermining the community. She painted herself as the protector of the neighborhood, the one keeping order, while others tried to tear it down. Her words were sharp, but they didn't land the way they used to. People weren't nodding in agreement anymore. They were frowning, exchanging skeptical looks, whispering in doubt. The treasurer, Douglas, cleared his throat. He was a quiet man, often overlooked. But tonight, his voice carried weight. He confirmed that the miscellaneous operations category had raised concerns even within the board. He admitted that when he asked for details, Marjorie brushed him off. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. He was a quiet man, often overlooked. But tonight, his voice carried weight. He confirmed that the miscellaneous operations category had raised concerns even within the board. He admitted that when he asked for details, Marjorie brushed him off. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. If even the treasurer didn't know where the money was going, then the truth was darker than anyone imagined. By the time the meeting adjourned, the room was buzzing with unease. Neighbors clustered in small groups, whispering about what they had just heard. Some glanced at me with nods of quiet support. Others avoided Marjorie altogether, their trust in her shattered. As I packed up my folder, I caught her watching me. Even behind those sunglasses, I could feel the weight of her glare. She didn't see me as just another homeowner anymore. She saw me as a threat, and threats, in her world, weren't tolerated. That night, as I walked home under the dim glow of the streetlights, I knew the fight was far from over. Marjorie wasn't going to give up her power without a war, and something told me she was already planning her next move. The battle lines had been drawn. The neighborhood had seen the cracks in her perfect facade, and now it was only a matter of time before the entire structure came crashing down. The night after the board meeting felt different. The quiet streets, usually a comfort, now seemed heavy with unspoken tension. Porch lights flickered like watchful eyes, and every creak of a fence or rustle of leaves felt like it carried meaning. I had stood my ground, raised questions no one had dared to ask, and in doing so, I had cracked the armor of the HOA president. But power doesn't slip away easily, and Marjorie wasn't the kind of person to surrender quietly. The retaliation began quickly, almost predictably, but with a precision that revealed just how long she'd been honing her tactics. Within days, new notices appeared in mailboxes. Neighbors whispered that they had received fresh fines this time for things so absurd they bordered on comedy. A trash can placed a few inches too close to the curb. A car parked with one tire resting on the faint line of a driveway. Even decorative garden flags were suddenly labeled unauthorized. And all of them, without exception, bore Marjorie's familiar signature. It was intimidation, pure and simple. A message to the community. Speak out, and you'll pay the price. I, of course, wasn't spared. Another envelope arrived at my door. This one more aggressive than the last. The fine had doubled to $1,000, this time, citing continued violations and non-compliance. My supposed offenses now included failure to maintain landscaping, despite my lawn being freshly mowed, and improper storage of tools for the latter. I had already moved inside weeks earlier. It was laughable, insulting, and infuriating all at once. But the real sting wasn't in the money. It was in the escalation. Marjorie wasn't just trying to silence me, she was trying to break me. Neighbors began to buckle under the pressure. Some paid their fines quietly, unwilling to risk the conflict. Others grumbled in hushed tones, but avoided open resistance. Fear hung over the cul-de-sac like a storm cloud, and Marjorie thrived in its shadow. She strutted through the neighborhood with renewed confidence, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the world back in distorted fragments. On the surface, she looked untouchable again. But beneath that surface, cracks were widening. People remembered the board meeting. They remembered Douglas admitting he had no answers about the budget. They remembered the uneasy silence when Marjorie tried to explain herself. And while fear kept many quiet, suspicion lingered. Whispers spread across lawns and driveways, carried in the low murmur of conversations behind closed doors. The turning point came one evening when Mr. Alvarez, the elderly neighbor with the perfect lawn, decided he'd had enough. Another fine had landed in his mailbox, this time for excessive watering, a claim so absurd it bordered on insulting. He marched across the street, notice in hand, and showed it to me. His voice trembled, not with age this time, but with anger. For the first time, he said aloud what so many had only dared to think. "She is stealing from us!" That single sentence shifted something. It was no longer just me fighting back. Others were beginning to see the truth for themselves. I began to organize quietly, carefully. Not an uprising, not yet, but small conversations with trusted neighbors, sharing my notes, showing them the financial reports. Each person I spoke to carried the burden of their own fines, their own frustrations, and when they saw how the pattern connected, their anger grew. A community that had once been silent under Marjorie's rule was beginning to murmur louder, and those murmurs were becoming voices. Marjorie, of course, sensed the shift. Her tactics grew harsher. Late-night letters slipped into mailboxes. Threats of property, liens for unpaid fines. Even rumors spread claims that certain homeowners were troublemakers, whispered to divide and isolate us. She played her game well, wielding fear like a weapon. But with each swing, she revealed her desperation. Then came the breaking point. One morning, as the neighborhood stirred awake, a notice appeared on the bulletin board near the community pool. It bore Marjorie S. signature and announced a new special assessment fee of $1,500 per household, citing vague community improvement projects. There were no details, no plans, no evidence of work to be done. Just a demand for money. This wasn't a fine. This was an outright grab. The reaction was immediate. People crowded around the board, voices raised, disbelief turning to outrage. Questions flew, accusations followed, and for the first time, the whispers became shouts. Neighbors who had once feared speaking out now demanded answers. I stood among them, watching the spark I had lit at the board meeting grow into something bigger. The anger wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the entire community. Marjorie had pushed too far. Her greed had exposed her, and in doing so, she had set the stage for her own downfall. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the houses in gold, I looked around the neighborhood and saw determination in faces that had once been weary. The people weren't broken. They were ready, and the battle for the truth was about to erupt into open war. The notice about the special assessment fee was the spark that lit the fire. What Marjorie thought would be another easy money grab turned into the catalyst for something she never expected unity. The neighborhood, once divided by fear and silence, now found itself bound by outrage. People who had once whispered in hushed tones were now speaking openly, their voices echoing across driveways and front lawns. By the next evening, small groups had formed. Neighbors compared notices, pulling crumpled envelopes from drawers and folders, lining them up on picnic tables and kitchen counters. The stories were eerily similar fines issued for trivial or invented violations, each signed by Marjorie herself. It wasn't just me, or Mr. Alvarez, or the Harris family. It was nearly everyone. Patterns emerged. Dates matched spikes in the financial reports. The amounts varied, but the result was always the same: more money funneled into miscellaneous operations, more unexplained withdrawals. Every piece of paper told the same story. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood tidy. This was theft, plain and simple. The quiet treasurer, Douglas, became an unlikely ally. After weeks of brushing off questions, he finally broke his silence. In a voice low with both fear and relief, he admitted that Marjorie had kept most of the financial details away from the board. Whenever he asked for receipts or invoices, she deflected. She insisted she was handling it and pressured him not to pry. But the truth had gnawed at him for months, and now, with the neighborhood rising against her, he felt safe enough to step forward. Douglas brought something more valuable than Word's documents. He dug through old emails, hidden folders, and board records that Marjorie had overlooked. What he uncovered was shocking. Withdrawals made out to cash, checks signed only by Marjorie, and expenses listed for services that never happened, repairs that were never completed, contractors that never existed. The numbers told a story so clear that it couldn't be denied anymore. Marjorie had been siphoning money from the HOA for her own use. The discovery spread through the community like wildfire. Photocopies circulated, neighbors passed them from hand to hand, and phones lit up with pictures of highlighted pages. The evidence was irrefutable. And with each new revelation, the outrage deepened. But anger alone wasn't enough. If we wanted real change, if we wanted Marjorie out, we had to act. That's when the idea of a recall surfaced. According to the bylaws, homeowners had the right to remove board members with enough votes. It wasn't easy. Marjorie had designed the rules to protect herself, but it was possible. All it would take was organization, signatures, and determination. The neighborhood mobilized like never before. Volunteers went door to door, gathering support. Some neighbors hesitated at first, afraid of retaliation, but the evidence spoke louder than fear. One by one, signatures filled the petitions. The same people who had once bowed to Marjorie's authority now stood together against her. Marjorie, of course, didn't sit idle. She fought back with every trick she had left. New fines appeared overnight. Threats of legal action scrawled in bold letters. Rumors spread claims that the recall was illegal, that homeowners would face consequences for participating. She even tried to pit neighbors against each other, suggesting some would benefit while others would suffer. But this time, her tactics fell flat. The people had seen too much. The lies no longer worked. Still, her desperation grew. Late at night, her car prowled the streets, headlights sweeping over driveways and porches like search. Neighbors whispered that she was collecting evidence, snapping pictures of anything she could twist into a violation. Others swore they heard her, muttering angrily during her patrols, pacing with her clipboard like a soldier guarding a crumbling fortress. By the time the petition reached the required number of signatures, the community was no longer afraid. It was angry, united, and ready to take back control. The recall vote was scheduled, and word spread fast. For the first time in years, neighbors looked at each other not with suspicion, but with solidarity. On the day of the vote, the community center overflowed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching papers, their faces set with determination. The air buzzed with tension, every whisper drowned out by the weight of what was about to happen. At the front of the room, Marjorie sat stiffly, sunglasses in place, clipboard resting in her lap. Her posture screamed confidence, but her hands betrayed her clutching the board's edge too tightly, her knuckles white. One by one, ballots were cast. It was slow, deliberate, each paper a small act of defiance, each mark a crack in Marjorie's reign. The room was silent, except for the soft rustle of paper and the scrape of pens. Every vote felt like a hammer striking against the wall she had built. And when the final count was tallied, the result was undeniable. The majority had voted her out. Marjorie's time as president was over. The room erupted not with cheers, but with the cathartic sound of voices rising. People finally free to speak without fear. For the first time in years, the community felt alive. But as Marjorie sat motionless, her sunglasses hiding her eyes, a chilling thought crept into the room. Losing her title wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning of her downfall. Because while the recall stripped her of power, the evidence of her theft could strip her of much more. And deep down, everyone knew this wasn't just about losing her job. It was about facing. The recall vote had stripped Marjorie of her title, but the air in the community wasn't filled with celebration. Not yet. There was a quiet, simmering energy relief mixed with anticipation, as if everyone knew the storm wasn't over. Removing her from the HOA was one thing. Holding her accountable for everything she had stolen was another. 4 days. The neighborhood hummed with activity. Copies of financial records circulated like wildfire, passed between households, slipped under doors, even pinned discreetly to bulletin boards. The once broken community had become something else entirely. An organized force. People who had once been too afraid to speak up now compared notes, swapping stories of every fine they had ever paid. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. And the image it formed was damning. Douglas, the treasurer, quietly handed over the most critical documents withdrawals signed only by Marjorie, checks written to accounts no one recognized, expenses logged for services never performed. The paper trail was undeniable. What had once been suspicions now stood as cold, hard evidence. And then came the final blow. A neighbor named Karen, ironically one of Marjorie's closest allies in the past, revealed that she had once been asked to cash a check on Marjorie's behalf. At the time, she didn't think much of it, chalking it up to a favor. But when she saw the mounting evidence, her guilt spilled out. The check, she remembered, had been for thousands of dollars, supposedly for landscaping improvements. No improvements were ever made. With testimony, financial records, and the neighborhood united against her, Marjorie was cornered. She had lost her power, lost her influence, and now she was about to lose everything else. It started small. Neighbors stopped acknowledging her on the street. Children whispered when she passed by, pointing at the woman who had tried to bleed their parents dry. The very people she once intimidated now looked at her with disgust. Her patrols with the clipboard stopped. The sunglasses disappeared, and her once confident stride turned into a nervous shuffle, shoulders hunched under the weight of shame. But the real consequences came when the neighborhood took the evidence beyond its own borders. Copies of the records were sent to the county, to legal authorities, to anyone who would listen. What began as a local scandal quickly grew into something larger. Investigators arrived, knocking on doors, asking questions. They collected statements, gathered documents, pieced together the years of fraud. The neighborhood watched in quiet awe as the woman who had once ruled over them was reduced to just another resident, forced to answer questions she could no longer deflect. When the charges came, no one was surprised. Embezzlement? Fraud? Abuse of power? Words that had once seemed too heavy, too dramatic, now fit her actions perfectly. The HOA had been her kingdom, but she had used it not to protect her neighbors, but to rob them. And now she would pay the price. The day she was escorted from the community center for questioning, the streets were lined with silent spectators. No one cheered. No one jeered. They just watched, some with relief, some with anger, and some with pity. Marjorie kept her head down, her once constant sunglasses absent, her clipboard nowhere in sight. The queen of the cul-de-sac had finally fallen. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The pool repairs, once a myth, finally started under the guidance of a new, transparent board. The sidewalks were patched, the fences repainted, and the petty fines vanished. For the first time in years, people felt free to enjoy their homes without fear of a letter waiting in the mailbox. Mr. Alvarez planted new flowers in his yard. The Harris kids set up their basketball hoop without worry. Neighbors waved to each other more often, no longer bound by suspicion or intimidation. The community wasn't perfect, but it was theirs again. As for Marjorie, her name became a warning. A story passed around whenever new residents moved in. She tried to fine us for everything, people would say, but in the end, she lost it all. I often thought back to the first letter I received, that absurd $500, fine for a hose and ladder. At the time, it had felt like an insult, a petty act of control. I had no idea it would be the thread that unraveled an entire scheme. But sometimes, that's how it happens. The smallest injustice reveals the biggest corruption. In the end, Marjorie didn't just lose her position. She lost her power, her reputation, and the trust of the very people she once ruled over. And as I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, and hearing the sound of children laughing in the street, I realized something. The neighborhood wasn't just free of her. It was stronger because of what it had endured. Marjorie had tried to control us through fear, but in the end, it was our unity that defeated her. And that, more than anything else, was her ultimate downfall. Story complete.